r/NoSleep. Posted by CIAHerpes. We found a town abandoned in the mountains. Something in it didn't want us to leave. Part 1. 3 months ago, my wife and I were on our way to visit my mother-in-law, living alone far up in the White Mountains. I had been driving for 5 hours, and my wife, Betty, started saying she needed to use the bathroom and that she was starving. My full bladder agreed with her on the first issue, though I also had tried to make good time and get there before nightfall, when the street signs would become harder to read. I had never been to Betty's mother's house before, or even the county it lay in. I pulled over the car on the side of Main Street, looking down the center of the town. It had everything a small, rural American town usually had: quaint houses with blue siding, 24-hour diners, hardware stores and tobacco shops, liquor stores and restaurants. Majestic mountains rose all around us, and the town itself was so high that I could see for miles. The air smelled clean and sweet. Everything was here, except no people, my wife said, as if reading my mind. I looked over at her, frowning. "Yeah, this is bizarre," I said. "This place looks like it was hit by the Black Death. Where is everyone?" My wife unlocked her door and got out, pulling a cigarette from her purse and lighting it. She gave the pack to me, and I took one. My wife looked pale and thin under the late afternoon sun, her black hair and dark eyes contrasting heavily with her light, Irish skin. Lately, she seemed to have lost weight, but she wouldn't talk about it. Every time I asked her if anything was wrong, she said no, and I could get no more response from her than that. The fragrant Turkish tobacco of the Camel cigarette instantly woke me up. We didn't smoke in the car, as it was brand new and had cost me over $25,000 that I didn't really have. The last thing I wanted was burn marks on the seats and ashes flying everywhere. We walked slowly down the sidewalk, looking around, searching for the slightest signs of movement. I didn't even see an animal, except for an occasional fly buzzing past on its way to eat garbage. I looked into the diner window, and saw plates set out on the tables. Mold grew wild on the food, strange patches of green and red and black sprouting filaments and making the dishes unrecognizable. Next to the plates, I saw cell phones and even car and house keys. All the screens on the phones looked black, as if they had been sitting there for months. A slight layer of grime and dust had settled over everything. The door stood wide open, a cheerful sign reading, "We're open. Come in," displayed on the front. "That's gotta be a code violation," I said, pointing inside at the disgusting plates of mold and fungus. My wife laughed, but it sounded nervous and high-pitched, almost desperate in its cadence. "Listen, Betty, do you think we should maybe call the police or something?" She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "I mean, I don't know," she said. "What crime has been committed? It's just an empty town. Maybe everyone's at a funeral?" Her voice raised hopefully. I laughed. "And they just abandoned their shops and restaurants with no workers and moldering food? And, by the way, there's a cop car right there," I said, pointing. It sat on 4 flat tires, covered in a thick coat of dust. The tires didn't look damaged in any way. It seems they had just lost pressure over time without anyone to care for them. Looking around at the other cars, I saw most were not in much better shape. Many of them had low or no air in their tires, and their windshields were covered in dirt and grime. It looked like a junkyard in the middle of a town, a junkyard that had been abandoned. "I'm calling the cops," I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the screen and, of course, found I had no service. I tried sending a text to my mother, explaining the situation and telling her to call the authorities if she received it and send help immediately. I gave her the name of the town and the time. I figured the chances of a text going through were far better than a call, since a brief moment of service could prove sufficient to transfer the message. "Yeah, I'm not calling the cops." I shook my head. "We don't have a shred of service out here. What kind of town doesn't have service on its own main street?" "We're in the middle of the mountains," Betty said. "Who the hell knows out here?" We kept walking down the street in silence. Betty went inside a few of the shops and tried flicking on the lights or looking for a phone. The electricity was apparently as dead as the town itself. I occasionally checked my phone, finding nothing had changed. As we walked further along, I started to give up hope that help would be coming from outside. I finished my cigarette, and Betty lit another one and gave me the pack again. I sighed and took another Camel out of the pack, lighting it and inhaling deeply. It gave me something to do, at least, and it helped take my mind off the strangeness of this town. Then we came up to the police station, and I choked on the smoke as I saw what lay there before us. At first, I thought some vandal had used red spray paint to put up a bizarre slogan across the front of the station. And then I saw the flies, and smelled the copper and iron, and I realized it likely wasn't paint at all. "We follow the black sun," it said in huge letters, each of them nearly 6 feet tall and thickly painted across the windows and walls. My wife squinted at it, tilting her head in a girlish way, her black hair falling across her face. She took a long, thin hand and pushed it aside. "The Black Sun?" she said. "Is that a metal band? It sounds like those Norwegian Satanists who like to listen to what's the name, Burzum and Dark Throne and stuff?" She started walking forwards, trying to inspect the letters more closely. I put my hand on her shoulder, and pulled her back with a little more force than I intended. She stumbled, and gave me a dirty look. "Johnny, be careful, damn it. You almost made me fall." "Sorry," I said, my heart pounding in my chest, "but don't get close to that. I'm fairly sure that's blood. And it might be a crime scene. You don't want to touch it or trample the area if it is." She looked at me, shocked, then glanced back at the letters, seeing the flies swarming around the coagulated, sticky mess. "Animal blood?" she asked helpfully. "Yeah, sure, I guess," I said non-committally. "Okay, let's go back to the car and get the hell out of here. I've seen enough. We need to get the cops here. Whatever is going on here, it's way beyond anything we can deal with." I turned around quickly, taking my wife's hand. She pulled away. "Don't start getting all worked up," she said. "We haven't seen any indication of anything crazy, not yet. All we know is that people are somewhere, not here, and that someone vandalized the police station. I want to keep exploring." I looked at her, amazed. She pointed past me at an old-looking church built of stone, probably from the 1800s. It stood near the end of the small downtown area, next to thick clusters of evergreen trees. It had a plaque outside that I couldn't make out. The doors stood wide open, and the darkness inside seemed to beckon. For a moment, I almost agreed with Betty. I almost said that I, too, wanted to go inside that church. I think it was what the French call l'appel du vide, or the call of the void that urged to suddenly jump when standing at the edge of a cliff, or to see if a car can go 130 miles an hour on the highway when it's snowing. Then I shook my head quickly, as if awakening from a short dream. I looked back at Betty and laughed. There was no humor in it, however. "You must be crazy," I said. "I want to get the hell out of here now. There's nothing to explore. Everyone's gone, and if we keep going deeper into this, I have a feeling we'll run into something far worse than anything we've yet seen." "Okay, how about this?" she said, making a thoughtful face, putting her finger up to her chin. "Why don't you see if the cop car is unlocked, jump it with our car, and use whatever they have in it to call for help. They probably have a walkie-talkie or something connected to the state police network. If you really think we need a SWAT team here, then that's probably the quickest way." "No, let's just leave," I said, walking quickly back in the direction of our car. I saw the new Chevrolet Trailblazer off in the distance, contrasting heavily with the dirty and abandoned cars surrounding it. And then, as we got close, I saw it had 4 flat tires. I started running forwards, seeing the deep knife marks slicing open each of the sidewalls. "What in the hell?" I said, stopping in my tracks. I looked around the town, but still saw no trace of anyone. Why? Why would someone do this? "To stop us from leaving, obviously," my wife said, sounding unperturbed. "Look, we might be here for a while, so I'm going into that package store and grabbing a few things. Maybe some wine. And some cigarettes, because someone smoked most of mine." She narrowed her eyes at me playfully. "Do you even realize what's happening right now?" I asked, my voice rising unconsciously in anger and frustration. "No, do you?" she said. "This isn't a joke," I said, feeling hot and anxious. "We're trapped here, and there's letters written in blood, and now someone slashed our tires. Do you still think we don't need the police?" She smiled at me. "You always worry too much," she said. "Just calm down for once. Don't have an anxiety attack on me. There's no cell phone service to call for help if you do, remember." That jogged something in my memory, and I looked questioningly at her. "Do you have any weapons on you?" I asked. "I have." I reached in my pockets, frowning. I pulled out a small Swiss Army knife. Its red surface looked dull from age, and even I thought it looked small and pathetic in my hand. "This," she laughed. "What are you going to do with that? Kill a chipmunk?" she asked. "I mean, I think you can cut your nails with it, too, if you want to use a dull, crappy pair of scissors that barely cut paper." She laughed at her own joke, then stopped when she saw the anger and fear on my face. Betty looked at me with a strange expression. It was hard to perturb her. She had always been different from me. When I was stressed about money or work or anything else, she would laugh it off and say I was too serious. But this seemed to be stretching the boundaries. I felt in my heart we were in danger, and she didn't seem to notice. "Look," she continued, sighing, "let's go get some more cigarettes and drinks and stuff, and then maybe we can take the car over to the police cruiser and jump it. Then we can call the cops, and AAA too, and just sit here and wait for the cavalry to arrive." I sputtered. "This is a brand new car," I yelled. "I'm not driving it on the rims over there. That's going to destroy the rotors and could damage some other stuff." I didn't actually know anything about cars, and she knew it. "No, I think it will be fine," she said, smiling. "But I wouldn't get my..." Her words were cut off by a siren that started up suddenly, deafening and shrill. It seemed to vibrate the air itself, and the dead town came to life in a cacophony of noise and vibration. I saw my wife's lips moving as she tried to scream something, but I had no idea what it was. I covered my ears with my hands, which barely helped. And then, after about 10 seconds, it stopped. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine like I had just walked into a flashbang. It went away slowly, and Betty's voice came back to me, rising from nothingness in a crescendo, until I could make out her cadence and speech again. "Into the siren," she said, her face unusually serious and drawn. The sun had started to go behind the mountains now, sending long shadows streaking across the road. Soon, it would be dark, and we would likely be trapped here for the entire night or longer. Hiking out of here was an option, and the highway was only about 5 miles away. These thoughts passed through my mind as I saw shadows fall over Betty, before I realized I had no idea what she said. "What?" I yelled. I said, she rolled her eyes at this point, "We should go towards the siren. They have electricity. They probably have a landline and maybe there's people there," she said, still speaking far too loudly. I guessed her ears were ringing as well. "Okay, you don't have to yell," I said. "I can hear you, and I don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention." She pointed at the sliced tires of my car. "We already have, Johnny," she said seriously. "Listen, I don't like this," I said. "I don't want to be trapped in some nutjob's basement a few hours from now, chained up against a wall and covered in blood, and think back on how I should have done something different. I think the safest plan is to leave this place now, right now. Let's just grab some drinks and cigarettes and whatever from the store and hike back towards the highway on the main route. Maybe we'll see someone on the walk, but we'll definitely find help on the highway." She thought about it for a fraction of a second then nodded. "Okay, whatever," she said. "Let's go." The plan worked at first. Betty ran into the package store while I kept watch outside, looking up and down the street for any signs of movement. I saw nothing, but from the slashed tires, I assumed we were being watched. Whoever they were, they knew when we were far enough away to vandalize the car. A minute later, Betty came out with a plastic bag. I saw 9 or 10 cartons of cigarettes in it and some plastic nips of Jack Daniels. She also had Coca-Cola and some water. "I thought you were grabbing a pack of cigarettes," I said, narrowing my eyes. "10 cartons? Why do we need 10 cartons for a 5-mile hike?" "We don't need them," she said, "but, you know, they're expensive down in Connecticut. Much cheaper in this town." "Yeah, I guess you can't beat free," I said, reaching into the bag and taking out a pack. We started walking out of town in silence. I didn't even hear an animal stir. The regular buzz of the insects that chirped and squeaked throughout the White Mountains was missing here. It gave the town a supernatural eeriness, as if we had wandered into an apocalyptic wasteland where even the crickets had died. To break the monotony, I lit a cigarette. The flick of the lighter and the soft tread of our footsteps were the only sounds we could hear for miles. As we got further down Main Street, the shops and houses started to thin out. Soon after we passed the church, both sides of the street had turned to forest, and only an occasional house or farm broke the endless trees. The downtown area couldn't be more than a quarter-mile long, but this town and the surrounding forest felt like it went on forever. "This is really spooky," Betty said, shattering the silence. I was glad for a break, though I felt eyes on me as she spoke, as if we had somehow violated the sanctity of a graveyard with laughter. "I have never experienced anything as weird as this," I said, whispering and getting close to Betty. I noticed she also spoke in a quiet voice, and she constantly glanced behind and around. She smoked a lot of cigarettes, nervously lighting one after the other, and she drank 3 of the nips on the way, chasing them down with Coke. I took one myself and downed it. The burning liquid seemed to revive me somewhat and clear my head. I chugged some soda to get the taste out of my mouth. Betty had opened her mouth to say something else, when the screaming erupted from all around us. The sun had long disappeared behind the mountains, and we were surrounded by thick curtains of darkness. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the forest. Betty gripped my hand tightly. "Okay, now I am really freaked out," she whispered into my ear. We had both stopped and stood, holding hands as shrieks echoed through the trees. The light breeze carried a smell that nearly made me gag, the smell of decay and blood. "Do you think it's a fox or a fish or cat or something?" I shook my head silently, then leaned close to her. "We're going to run," I said. "Back towards the town. It's a lot closer. Ready?" She nodded grimly. "Go." We started sprinting away, our footsteps bouncing off the pavement, far too loud. The screaming drew closer and something broke through the outer boundary of the woods. With twigs crunching and branches snapping, I saw a silhouette emerge into the road to my left. The smell of rotting flesh seemed overwhelming now. I only saw her for a second, but I knew, in that moment, that she wasn't human. It looked like a woman, or at least, like the corpse of one. But she was clearly alive in some form, running and shrieking, sending out wails of pure agony and horror. The eyes snapped onto me. I met them for a brief moment. Even in the dim light of the moon and the stars, I could see they were pure white, without pupils or irises. And yet, they seemed to see everything, even in the deepening shadows. Long, stringy black hair ran down over her face and down her back. Papery skin hung tightly to the skull, and the mouth hung wide open, inhumanly wide, like the tendons and ligaments holding the jaw to the skull had been cut. The huge black pit of her mouth emanated those screams constantly, as if she didn't need to breathe. On the body, parts of the skin were missing. I could see the gore and bones beneath, where the thin, fragile skin had broken. Purple and black sores shone from these spots. The long, skeletal hand of the woman ended up claw-like fingers, with the nails blackened and the bones sticking out at the end of each digit. She ran fast, gaining on us. And she wasn't alone. I could see dozens more bodies breaking through the tree line now, a deafening howling emanating from them as they ran. I was breathing hard by this point. I could see the first buildings of the town up ahead. We only had to make it another 100 paces, and then we could lock ourselves in and barricade the doors and windows. I didn't dare look back, but I heard the screaming just behind me. I felt a soft swipe across my back, the sharp, bony fingers dragging across the shirt for a brief moment. It gave me another adrenaline rush, and I pushed myself forward with all of my will, feeling my heart beating far too fast in my chest. I began to feel lightheaded and see flashes of white light every time I blinked. I knew I would pass out if I had to go much farther. I hadn't gone running in over 10 years, probably since I was in high school. But I ran for my life just the same. Betty was in better shape than me, and she had gained some ground. She glanced back as she sprinted down the middle of the dark street. I saw her point to the church. It stood just ahead, the doors already opened, as if waiting for us, as if it knew we would be back. She veered sharply to the right and I followed close behind, panting and sweating like a madman. The doors were so close now. The shrieking behind me had been joined by a few others. With the last of my strength, I began an all-out sprint, hoping I wouldn't trip over something and go flying into a car. It would mean the end of me of that, I was certain. We ran through the doors into the church. I turned around, and saw the creatures had gone. Their screaming cut off as soon as we had entered, and now I saw no sign of them. It was as if they had vanished. I shut the doors of the church just the same, turning a deadbolt to lock them. Betty had her phone out, turning on the flashlight app to help me see in the dark church. I would have to also check for auxiliary entrances, but it was a start, just the same. And then I turned, and I saw what Betty had already noticed: the desecration of this holy place. The statue of Jesus on his cross had been broken off at the bottom of the beam, and now hung upside down from a rope that extended to the high ceiling, dozens of feet above our heads. His face had been slashed and cut, his nose and eyes now missing, and on the front of his chest, I saw a strange symbol carved deeply into the wood with what looked like blood. The sigil looked like an upside-down triangle within a larger upside-down triangle, and had lines curving out of the sides of the bottom. Connected to the lines of the larger triangle, at the bottom, I saw a line curving like a J, and on the other side, another line curved like a backwards J. The lines extended outwards, curving over a V. Around the sigil sat a thick, black circle. It definitely seemed magical, like something from a medieval textbook on witchcraft. "That's the sigil of Lucifer," my wife said quietly. "How do you know that?" I asked, and she shrugged. "I read a couple books on black magic when I was a teen," she said. "That one stuck with me for some reason. That symbol, it's eerie. I never forgot it." I looked over at the font at the front of the church. Instead of holy water, I saw it was filled with blood. "I guess no one's crossing themselves in here today," I said, trying to break the harsh terror that threatened to overwhelm us. Then, as Betty moved her light around, I realized we weren't alone in here. People sat in the pews, their heads bowed, silently praying. Dozens of people were in here with us, yet they made no noise, and no one turned their heads to look at us or say anything. An icy chill ran down my spine. I turned to Betty and pointed at the people. "Yeah, I see them," she whispered, and began to creep slowly forward. I took out my phone and turned on my light as well, moving silently a few feet behind her. I shone the light at the first pew of people and gasped. They all had their throats cut. A waterfall of thick, coagulated blood stained the front of their bodies. The smell hit me at once, an overwhelming odor of rotting meat and iron. I gagged, turning to Reg. Betty pulled me towards the back of the church. I searched for any other entrances, locking the ancient deadbolts on the doors. We ended up going to the rectory in the back, sitting on the priest's couch. There were no bodies in here, and no smell but the musty scent of an old building and books. "Well," Betty said, turning to me, barely concealing the terror in her eyes, "it looks like we found the townspeople. Some of them, anyways." I said nothing, but instead put my phone down and sat in the darkness with her, putting my arm around her while she cried.